Hello and welcome back to my channel, Civil War Reports. I am your War of the Rebellion reporter, Brian Thomas Kopak, and today we're going to do something we haven't done yet on Civil War Reports, and that is we're going to take a look at an individual regiment and give you a brief history about their experience during the American Civil War. And for the first regiment I chose is the 41st New York. And I didn't choose them because they had some spectacular battlefield record and fought in a lot of great battles and suffered heavy casualties. I picked them for basically two reasons. One, they're from my original home state of New York, and because they have a rather unique origin in the fact that they were, at the beginning of the war, considered an all-German regiment. And the second reason, been very fascinated for a number of years with German history, particularly in the post-Civil War era from 1870, 1871, when Germany was unified as a result of the Franco-Prussian War, up to and including World War I. Very fascinated with that time period in German history. At this point, I want to stop for a moment and give a big shout out. A company I work for is German-based. It's owned by, it's a German-owned company, and we have a few Germans at my job that I like to consider on loan to us here in the United States. So a shout out to the following Germans I work with. I want to say big shout out to Christian and Guido and Stefan and Eric and Stefan, and honorary shout out to two Germans I used to work with but who went back home to Deutschland. So an honorary shout out to Matthias and to Marcel. Hope you're having a great time back home. And there's one other German I work with who, and Philip. Can't forget Philip. And one other German I work with who asked not to be mentioned in the shout out. So to him I say, no shout out to you. I take pride in my shout outs. Well, that's probably wrong show and definitely wrong war. After Fort Sumter was fired upon, wave of patriotism swept across the North, and Lincoln asked for volunteers, and a lot of Germans stepped forward, and it would become the 41st New York, also known as the DeKalb Regiment. As I mentioned, all Germans. Now, at the beginning of the war, the Union Army really did want German immigrants to join because of the conflicts that had taken place in Europe in the 1840s. They felt that these men would have the military experience that the Union Army needed. So when these folks were mustered into federal service on June 9th, 1861, they were really welcomed by the Union Army. Also, why I wanted to choose this regiment is they have a really great regimental history. It's called Carl Borneman's Regiment. Carl Borneman was a lieutenant in the 41st New York, and he kept a diary, and his diary is the basis for this regimental history. And like a lot of German immigrants at the time, he didn't speak much English, he didn't write much English, so his regimental history, his diary, shall we say, was written all in German. His granddaughter ended up having it translated into English, and it does become the basis for this regimental history. And at the start of the war, the 41st New York was not unlike a lot of other New York regiments in the fact that they had their own unique special uniform. And while I could not find any photographs of this uniform, there is a description of it here in the regimental history. Quote, the dress consists of a dark green frock coat trimmed with red on the collar and cuffs, gray pantaloons trimmed with a red cord, and cloth caps of the same color as the coats faced with red. The troops are also provided an overcoat of gray pilot cloth made after the Prussian Army regulations. The overcoats were meant to serve as blankets. The men were also issued havelocks and comfortably designed knapsacks. So as mentioned, the 41st New York was mustered into federal service on June 9th, 1861, and their journey to Washington, D.C. was a rather roundabout one, starting off with them catching a ferry across the Hudson River to take them to Elizabethport City, New Jersey, where they caught a train that took them not straight south to Washington, D.C., but rather southwest to Reading, Pennsylvania, where they caught another train that took them to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where they picked up another train that took them to Baltimore, Maryland, and then finally onto Washington, D.C. So they were there in time for First Bull Run or First Manassas, but they did not participate. They were actually left in the Washington, D.C. area to guard the Union camps. The DeKalb Regiment would be in service for almost exactly 1 year before they would ever see the elephant. That was a term that soldiers used back then to describe being in combat. Their first taste of combat would come on June 8th, 1862 in the Shenandoah Valley. They belonged to General Blenker's division, which was part of General Fremantle's Mountain Army, and they would come under attack from part of General Jackson's foot cavalry under the command of Richard Ewell. And their first encounter would be with the skirmishers of the 15th Alabama. The 15th Alabama would play a major role in the attack on Little Round Top in Gettysburg more than a year later. Well, the Battle of Cross Keys did not go very well for the Union Army, and they were in retreat. Following that defeat there, shortly thereafter, President Abraham Lincoln created what was called the Army of Virginia. 3 corps placed under the command of Major General John Pope. And what was Fremantle's command became the 1st Corps of the Army of Virginia. And Fremantle was, his military career was basically over, and he was sent out west. And the 41st New York, along with a lot of the other New York regiments, were very happy to hear that his replacement was a fellow German immigrant, a general by the name of Franz Sigel. He was greatly loved by his men, and they even had a song about him, "I goes to fight mit Sigel." And Sigel, however, was not very popular among the generals here in the Eastern Theater because, well, he was trained militarily in Prussia and he was not a West Pointer. Well, the next battle for the 41st New York, next major engagement, would be Second Bull Run or Second Manassas. And although they were deployed in about 6 different positions during that battle, Second Manassas ended for the Union Army much the same way as First Manassas did. And following the Union Army's retreat back to Washington, Robert E. Lee took his army fresh off of that victory at Second Manassas. Some will say that was his greatest victory ever. He heads north, which will culminate in the Antietam campaign. The 41st New York did not take part in that. Following Second Manassas, General Pope's army was dissolved. General Pope was also sent out west and thus pretty much ended his Civil War military career. And what was the 1st Corps of the Army of Virginia would become the 11th Corps of the Army of the Potomac. So the DeKalb Regiment was not at the Battle of Antietam. They remained behind in Washington to guard that city. And the next major engagement for the Army of the Potomac would be the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862. By this time, General Burnside is in command of the army, and he has created what were known as grand divisions. 2 corps equaled 1 grand division. The 11th Corps, again under the command of General Franz Sigel, was not assigned to a grand division, and they were held in reserve. Shortly thereafter, General Burnside was removed and replaced with Joseph Hooker. Hooker and Franz Sigel did not get along very well, and Sigel asked to be relieved of command, which he was, and he was replaced by the one-armed General Oliver Otis Howard. The soldiers of the 11th Corps did not particularly care for Oliver Otis Howard, and it would cause friction in the ranks, and Oliver Otis Howard would make many mistakes at the Battle of Chancellorsville, which would cost the 11th Corps its reputation. The next time the 41st New York would see action would not be until the Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863. They were part of Joseph Hooker's army, and Hooker had a grand scheme to smash Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. A good plan that should have worked, except for the fact that Hooker's ego got in the way, and he really didn't realize how much General Lee and Stonewall Jackson were not prepared to have their young nation crushed in 1863. I'm standing at the extreme right of Hooker's army. Off into the distance is some woods, and it was from there that Stonewall Jackson's flanking attack would hit the extreme right of Hooker's army, and the 1st Brigade to bear the brunt of that attack would be Colonel Leopold von Giesel's brigade. He was the original colonel of the 41st New York, and I'm standing roughly in the area where the 41st New York would have been stationed. Very little was done to prepare for a flanking attack because it simply wasn't expected. Von Giesel did refuse his flank a little bit by bending back and facing to the west 2 regiments, the 54th New York, which was also an all-German regiment from New York, and the 153rd Pennsylvania. The 1st regiment in line was the 41st New York. So when they started to notice deer and bunny rabbits coming out of the woods, the men realized that there was probably something in that woods that should be concerned. But the time of day that Stonewall attacked, the men had stacked arms, they were cooking or eating dinner, they were not expecting an attack. So when Stonewall Jackson's men came out of that woods, the first regiments they hit was von Giesel's brigade, including the 41st New York. In an effort to try to save themselves from either being killed or captured, most of the men just broke and ran, heading back towards the Union main line. William Southerton, a soldier in the 75th Ohio, recalled this story, that as the 11th Corps was breaking and running, he came across a member of the 41st New York crouched down hiding in some bushes, and the member of the 41st looked at him and said, "Mit Gott in Himmel," translated, "My God in heaven." That was the reaction of the members of the 41st New York, and I'm sure many other regiments that were hit by Stonewall Jackson's corps. Keep in mind that when Jackson hit, his line was 2 miles long and 3 divisions deep. An estimated 20 to 28,000 Confederates attacked this area. His line was, as I said, 2 miles long. 1 mile north of the Plank Road and 1 mile south of it. This was a massive attack. And unfortunately, in my opinion, the soldiers of the 11th Corps took a bad rap. They were given nicknames like the Flying Dutchies and the Flying Dutchman and the Running Dutchman. And in my opinion, it was not the fault of the individual soldier. It really falls, in my opinion, on the shoulders of their Corps commander, Oliver Otis Howard. He was not here. He did not heed the warnings that something could possibly be happening that would cause his corps to be attacked in flank like it was.